Hi there, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to Reading Thucydides Peloponnesian War. Last time we met, we had a quick chapter because we finished the winter of the fourth year of the war. Now, this session, we're going to be going over the spring of the fifth year, the spring summer of the fifth year of the war, and this is in chapter starting with chapter 25. Well, I said 24. I should have said 25. Uh, Oops, my mistake on the thing. I have to correct my. I correct it. So we'll see what happens. 25, 26. We talked about 26 ends the ends the story of the Spartan going to get the Trimene going in there, encouraging them to kind of hold off. Making a deal with the Metelians, making a deal with the deal with the Athenians, the Spartans come saying, "We're going to come, we're coming." Um, we start now the next summer, right? This is the next summer of this. The next summer, the Peloponnesians set off 42 ships from Mytilene under Alcides, their admiral, and themselves and their allies invaded Attica. Their object being to distract the Athenians by a double movement, and thus make it less easy for them to act against the fleet sailing to Mytilene. The commanders of this invasion was Cleomenes, and in place of the king Pantuson, Pelemax, his nephew, who was still a minor. Not content with laying waste to whatever had grown up in the parts which had before devastated, the invaders now extended their ravages to land passed over in their previous incursion, so that this invasion was more seriously felt by the Athenians than any except the second. The enemy stayed until they had overrun most of the country, and in the expectation of having from Lesbos of something having been achieved by their fleet, which they thought must by now have gotten over. However, as none of their expectations were realized, they and their provisions began to run short. They retreated and dispersed to their different cities. And meanwhile, the Milesians, finding their provisions failing, while the fleet from the Peloponnesian were loitering on their way instead of appearing at Mytilene, were compelled to come to terms with the Athenians in the foul manners. Salalitis, having himself ceased to expect the fleet to arrive, now armed the people with heavy armor, which they had not before possessed, with the intention of making a sortie against the Athenians. The people, however, no sooner found themselves in possession of the armor than they refused any longer to obey their officers, and meeting in groups, told the authorities to bring the grain reserve out of the public and divide it among them all, or they would themselves come to terms with the Athenians and deliver up the city. Those who were in power were aware of their inability to prevent this, and the danger that they would be in if let out of their of the capitulation. Publicly agreed with Paches and the army to surrender Mytilene unconditionally and admit the troops in the cities upon the understanding that the Mytileans should be allowed to send an envoy to Athens to please their cause, and Paches should not imprison, make slaves, or put to death any of the citizens until its return. Such were the terms of the capitulation, in spite of which the chief authors of the negotiations with Sparta were so completely overcome by terror, which the army entered, that they went and seated themselves at the altars from which they were raised up by Paches on the promise that he would do them no wrong, enlarged by him in Trendos, until he should have the pleasure, learn the pleasure of Athens concerning them. Paches also sent some trimenes and seized Anestus and took such other military measures he thought advisable. Meanwhile, the Peloponnesians and their 40 ships, who ought to have made all haste to relieve Mytilene, lost time in coming around the Peloponnesian south, and proceeding leisurely on the remaining of the voyage, made Delos without having been seen by the Athenians at Athens. For whence, from hence, arriving at Acharis and Mecas, they first heard of the fall of Mytilene. Wishing to know the truth, they put Antibodum on the territories of Etria about 7 days after the capture of the city, whence he learned the truth and began to considering what they should do. And Therapeutus, the Elysian, addressed him as follows: Heraclides and the Peloponnesians who share with me the command of this armament. My advice is to sail just as we are to Metling, before we have heard of it. We may expect to find the Athenians as much on their guard as men generally who have just taken a city. This will certainly be so by sea, where they have no idea of any enemy attacking them, and where our strength, as it happens, mainly lies. Even while their land forces are probably scattered about the houses in the carelessness of victory. If therefore we fall upon them suddenly and in the night, I have hopes that with the helps of well wishers that we may have left inside the city, that we shall may become masters of the place. Let us not shrink from the risk, but let us remember that this is just the occasion of one of the baseless panics common in war, and that to be able to guard against these in one's own case, and to detect the moment when the attack will find the enemy at the disadvantage, is what makes successful general. 31. Those words of Trepidus failing to move Euclides, some of the Ionian exiles and the Lesbians with the expedition began to urge him, since this seemed too dangerous, to seize one of the Ionian cities or the Aetolic city of Chemme, and to use it as a base for effecting the revolt of Ionia. This was by no means a hopeless enterprise, as their coming was a welcome everywhere. Their object would be by this move to deprive Athens of her chief source of revenue, and by the same time saddle her with expense if they chose to blockade them, and would probably induce Peristus to join them in the war. However, else Euclides gave this proposal a bad reception, as bad a reception as other, being eager since he had come too late from Metling to find himself back in the Peloponnesus as soon as possible. 33. According, he put out from Embatum and proceeded along shore, touching at the Tyrian city. Myonnesus there butchered most of the prisoners that he had taken on his passage. Upon his coming to the anchor at Ephesus, envoys came to him from the Sarmatians and Anaya, and told him that he was not going the right way to free Hela, and in massacring men who had never raised a hand against him, and who were not enemies of his, but allies of Athens against their will, and that if he did not stop, he would turn many more fresh friends into enemies than enemies into friends. Alcides agreed to this and let the Chaldeans still in his hands, and some of the others that he had taken, since the inhabitants, rather than fleeing, came up to him because they assumed his vessels were Athenians, and had no sort of expectations that Peloponnesian ships would venture over Ionia while the Athenian commanded the sea. From Ephesus, Alcides set sail in haste and fled. He had been seen while still at anchor off Claros by the Athenian triremes, the Samalian, and the Piraeus, which happened to be sailing from Athens. And fearing pursuit, he now made across the open sea, fully determined to touch nowhere, if he could help it, until he got to the Peloponnesus. Meanwhile, news of him came to Patches from the territory of Etria, and indeed from all quarters, as Ionia was unfortified, Great fears were felt that the Peloponnesian coasting along shore, even if they had not intended to stay, might make descendants in passing and plunder the cities. Now the Tremius, Salamandia, and Passius, having seen him at Cowes, themselves brought intelligence of the fact. Patches accordingly gave chase and continued the pursuit as far as the island of Patmos, and then finding that Alexis had gone too far to be overtaken, came back again. Meanwhile, he thought it fortunate that, as he had not fallen on us with them out of sea, he had not overtaking them anywhere when they could have been forced to encamp. So he gave the trouble. So he gave and so give him trouble of blockading them. He's saying what? He's saying that he's happy that he kept on running because otherwise if he stayed there he had to blockade him and have to use ships. On his return along the shore, Patles touched, among other places, the Nostrum, the port of Cleophon, whom the Cleophonians had settled after the capture of the upper city by the Itimes and the barbarians who had been called in by certain individuals in a party quarrel. The capture of the city took place around the time of the Peloponnesian invasion of Attica. However, the refugees, after settling at Notrum, again split up in a faction, one of them called in Archaeans and barbarian mercenaries from the Pitilinus, and entrenched these in a quarter apart, forming a new community with the Median party of the Cleophasians, who joined them in the upper city. Their opponents had retired in exile and now called in Patches, who invited Hippias, the commander of the Arcadians, in the fortified quarter to a parley, upon conditions that if they could not agree, he was to put back safe and sound into fortification. However, upon his coming out to him, Patches put him in custody, though not in chains, and attacked suddenly and took by surprise the fortifications, and putting these Arcadians and barbarians found it into the sword. Afterwards took Hippias in as he had promised, and as soon as he was inside, seized him and slaughtered him. Patches gave him up to Notarum, to the Cleopatans, not to the Median party, and and the settlers were afterwards sent out from Athens, and the place colonized according to Athenian laws after collecting all the collocations found in any of the cities. Um, arrived Arrived at Mytilene, Patches reduced Petria and Utus, having found the Spartan Salathlitus in hiding in the city, sent him off to Athens together with the militians that he had placed in Terendos, and any other persons he thought concerned with the revolt. He also sent back the greater part of his forces, remaining with the rest to settle in Mytilene, and the rest of Lesbos he thought best. Upon arrival of the prisoners with Salamathus, the Athenians at once put the latter to death, although he offered, among other things, to proceed to procure the withdrawal of Peloponnesians from Plata, which were still under siege, and after deliberating as what they should do with the former, in the fury of the moment, determined to put to death not only the prisoners at Athens, but the whole male adult population in Mytilene, and to make slaves of the women and children. It was noted that Mytilene had revolted without being, at the same way, as the rest subject to the empire. And what above all swelled the wrath of the Athenians was the fact that the Peloponnesian fleet, having ventured over to Ionia to support a fact that which had held, in other words, support a fact which was held to argue a long mitigated rebellion. They accordingly sent a tribune to communicate the decrees to Patches, commanding him to waste no time dispatching the Metlians. The morrow brought repentance with it. The next day, brought repentance with it and reflections on the horrid cruelty the decree had condemned the whole city to the fate merit not only the guilty. Thus, no sooner perceived by the Metlian ambassador at Athens and their Athenian supporters than they had moved the authorities to put the question again to the vote, which they more easily consented to, as they themselves plainly saw that most of the citizens wished someone to give them the opportunity for considering the matter. The assembly was therefore once called, and after the expression of the opinion of both sides, Cleon, son of Cleonus, the same who would carry the former motion of putting Metlians to death, the most violent man at Athens at the time, by far the most powerful of the people who came forward against them, spoke as follows. And this is his Cleon's speech. I have often before now been convinced that democracy is incapable of empire, and never more so now than by your present change of mind in the matter of Metli. Fear or plots being unknown to you in your daily relations with each other, you feel just the same with regard to your allies, and never reflect the mistakes which you may be led into by making listening to their appeals or giving way to your own compassion, as are full of dangers to yourself, and being no thanks for your weakness and your allies, entirely forgetting that your empire is a despotism and your subject is an affected conspirator, whose obedience is ensured not only by your suicide concessions, but by the superiority given to you by your own strength and not their loyalty. The most alarming feature in case of is the constant change of measures, which we appear to be threatened, and our seeming ignorance of the fact that bad laws, which are never changed for our which are never changed, are better for a city than good ones that have no authority. That unlearned loyalty is more serviceable than quick-witted insubordination, and that ordinary men usually manage public affairs better than their more gifted fellows. The latter are always wanting to appear wiser than the laws, and overruled every proposition brought forward, thinking that they cannot show their wit in a more important manner than by some behaviors to ruin their country, while those who mistrust their own cleverness are content to be less learned than the laws, and less able to pick holes in the speech of a good speaker, and being fair judges rather than rival athletes, generally conduct affairs successfully. These we ought to imitate instead of being led by the cleverness and intellectual rivalry to advise the people against our real opinions. For myself, I adhere to my former opinion, and wonder at those who have proposed to reopen the case of the Metlians, and who are thus causing a delay which is which all in favor of the guilty, by making the sufferer proceed against the offended with the edge and anger his more blunted, although the vengeance follows more closely upon the wrong. It best equals it and most amply requires it. I wonder also who will be the man who will maintain the contrary and pretend to show that the crimes of the Miltians are of service to us, and our misfortunes injuries to the allies. Such a man must plainly have such confidence in his rhetoric as to attempt to prove that what has been once for all decided is still undetermined, and be bribed to try to delude us by elaborate sophistic arguments. In such contests, the city gives the reward to others and takes the danger for herself. The persons to blame are you, who are so foolish as to institute these contests, who goes to see an oration as though you would as you would to a sight, take your facts as hearsay, judge the practicality of a project by the wit of its advocates, and trust for the truth as to past events, and not to the facts which you saw more clearly than to the clever strictures you have heard. The easy victims of newfangled arguments, unwilling to follow received conclusions, slaves to every new paradox, despisers of the commonplace, which the first wish of every man being that he could speak himself, the next to his rival, those who can speak by seeming to keep up with their ideas by applauding every hit almost before it is made, and as being as quick in catching an argument as you are slow in foreseeing its consequences. Asking, if I may so say, for something different from the conditions under which we live, and yet comprehending inadequately those very conditions, very slaves to the pleasure of the ear, and more likely the audience of a rhetorician than the council of a city. In order to keep you from this, I proceed to show that no one city has ever injured you as much as Methley. I can make allowance for those who revolt because they cannot bear our empire, and who have been forced to do so by the enemy. But for those who possessed an island with fortifications, who could fear our enemy only by sea, and there had their own forces of trimeans to protect them, who were independent and held in the highest honor by you, to act as these have done. This is not a revolt. Revolt implies oppression. It is deliberative. It is wanton aggression. It is an attempt to ruin us by siding with our bitter enemy. A worse offense than a war taken on its own accord in the acquisition of power. The fate of those of our neighbors who had already rebelled and had been subdued was no lesson to them. Their own prosperity could not dissuade them from affronting danger, but blindly confident in their future and full of hopes beyond their power, though not beyond their ambitions, they declared war and made their decision to prefer might to right, their attack being determined not by provocation but by the moment which seemed uh, pro, propitious and beneficial for them. The truth is that great good fortune coming suddenly and unexpectedly tends to make a people insolent. In most cases, it is safer for mankind to have success in reason than out of reason, and it is easier for them, one may say, to starve off adversity than to preserve prosperity. Our mistake has been to distinguish the Metelians as we have done. They have been long ago treated like the rest. Had they been treated long ago like the rest, they would never have so forgotten themselves, human nature being as surely made arrogant by consideration as it is awed by firmness. Let them now, therefore, be punished as the crime requires. Do not, while you condemn the aristocracy, absolve the people. It is certain that all attacked you without distinction, although they might have come over to us and now be in possession of their city. But no, they thought it safer to throw their lot with the aristocracy and to join in their rebellion. Consider therefore, if you are subject to the same punishment the ally who is forced to rebel by the enemy, and whom does not do so by free choice, which of them think you there will is there that you will not rebel upon the slightest pretext, when the reward of success is freedom and the penalty of failure is nothing so terrible? We meanwhile shall uh, have to risk our money and our lives against one city after another, and if successful, shall receive a ruined city from which we can no longer draw the revenue upon which our strength depends. While, if unsuccessful, we shall have an enemy the more upon our hands, and have to spend the time that might have been employed by combating the existing foes in warring with our own allies. No hope, therefore, must be held up to the Mytileans, that their rhetoric may inspire or money purchase the mercy due to human infirmity. Their offenses was not involuntary, but of malice and deliberate, and mercy is only for unwilling offenders. I, therefore, now at the before persist against your reversing your first decision, or giving way to the three failing most fatal of empires. Pity, the three failings fatal to most empires. Pity, sentiment, and indulgence. Compassion is due to those who can uh, 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 reciprocate the feeling, not to those who will never pity us in return, but are our natural and necessary foes. The orator who charmed us with sentiment may find others less important, find less important arenas for their talents. In the place of one, in the place of one where the city pays the heaviest penalty for a momentary pleasure, themselves receiving fines acknowledgement for their fine phrases, where indulgence should be shown to those whom will be our friends in the future, instead towards men who remain just what they were, and as much our enemy as before. To sum it up shortly, I say that if you follow my advice, you will do what is just towards the Metelians, and at the same time expedient, while and by a different decision you will not obligate them so much as pass sentence upon yourself. For if they were right in rebellion, you must be wrong in ruling. However, if right or wrong you determine to rule, you must carry out your principle and punish the Miltians as your interest requires, or else you must give up your empire and cultivate honesty without danger. Make up your minds, therefore, to give them like for like, and do not let the victims who escaped the plot be more insensible than the conspirators who hatched it, but reflect that they would have done if victorious over you, especially if they were the aggressors. It, it is they who wrong their neighbor without cause and pursue the victim to the death on account of the danger which they foresee in letting their enemy survive. Since the object of wanton wrong is more dangerous, if he escapes, than an enemy who has not this to complain of. Do not therefore be traitors to yourself, but recall as nearly as possible the moment of suffering and the extreme importance to which you were attached to their reduction, and now pay them back in turn, thus yielding to present weakness, forgetting the peril which that hung over you. Punish them as they deserve, and teach your allies by a striking example that the penalty of rebellion is death. Let them understand this, and you will have so often to you will not have to so often neglect your enemies while you are fighting with your own confederates. Such were the words of Cleon. After him, Diotatus, son of Ecleus, who had also been in the previous assembly, spoke strongly against putting them in the Tiandas, came forward and spoke thusly. I do not blame the persons who have reopened the case of the Metlians, nor do I approve the protest which we have heard against important questions being frequently debated. I think the two things most opposed to good counsel are haste and passion. Haste usually goes hand in hand with folly, passions with coarseness and narrowness of mind. As for the argument that speech ought not to be expedient of action, the man who uses it must be either senseless or personally interested. Senseless if he believed if it was possible to deal with uncertain future through any other medium interested if wishing to carry a most disgraceful measure and doubting his ability to speak well in a bad cause. He thinks to frighten opponents and hearers by well aimed calumny. Pardon, I need to get some water. Section 3 here of 42. What is more intolerable is to accuse a speaker of making a display in order to be paid for it. If ignorance were only imputed, an unsuccessful speaker might retire with a reputation for honesty, if not for wisdom, while the charge of dishonesty makes him suspected, if successful, and thought if he defeated not only a fool but a rogue, if defeated not only a fool but a rogue. The city is no gainer by such a system, since fear deprives it of advisors. Although, in truth, if our speakers are to make such assertions, it would be better for the country if they could not speak at all, as we should then make fewer blunders. The good citizens ought uh, the good citizens ought to triumph not by frightening his opponent, but by beating them fairly in argument. In a wise city, without over distinguishing its best advisers, will nevertheless not deprive them of their due, and far from punishing an unlikely consular, will not even regard him as disgraced. In this way, orators will be least tempted to sacrifice their convictions for popularity in the hope of still higher honors, and unsuccessful speakers to resort to the same popular arts in order to win the multitude. Now, this is interesting. So, if Cleon came out there with the argument that democracy is an idiotic thing, they make your minds like this, and the fancy speakers there should be the fancy speakers should be told to shut up. Their fine speaking is so good it convinces people that they're right when they're really wrong. This is the famous, the rhetoricians are able to persuade by passions and emotions, and Kant gives a powerful argument. Now, I want to get the name right. Um, um, Diodotus, Diodotus' speech is more kind of the conservative argument, saying, no, actually, in democracy, it's better that you allow these people to speak and wrong people doing that. In other words, it's a much better situation in a sense. In other words, it is dangerous that if you do this, I repeat 43. In other words, you just follow what people are going to ultimately follow what the popularity is. But we need to allow people to say the truth and say things that are, this way. In other words, this is the classic free speech argument, right? Uh, this is not our way. And besides, the moment that a man is suspected of giving advice, however good, from corrupt motives, we we feel a grudge against him for the gain that which, after all, we are not certain he will receive. That we deprive the city of its certain benefit. Plain good advice has thus come to be no less suspected than bad, and the advocates of the most monstrous measures is not more obliged to use deceit than gain to gain the people than the best counselor is to lie in order to be believed. City and the city only, owing to these refinements, can never be served openly without disguise. He who does serve it openly, being always suspected of serving himself in some way, secret way in return. Still, considering the magnitude of the interest involved, in which position of affairs, we orators must make it our business to look a little further than you who judge offhand, especially as we, your advisors, are responsible. while you, our audience, are not so. And if those who gave advice and those who took it suffered equally, you would judge more calmly, as you visit the disaster in which the whim of the moment may have led you upon the single person of your advisor, not yourselves as numerous companions in error. However, I have not come forward either to oppose or to accuse in the matter of meddling. Indeed, the question before us as sensible men is not their guilt, but our interests. Therefore, I prove them ever so guilty. I shall not, therefore, advise their death unless it be expedient, nor thought they should have claims to indulgence. Shall I recommend it, unless it be clearly for the good of the country, good of Athens. I consider that we are deliberating for the future more than the present. And where Cleon is so positive as to use deterrent effects that will follow from making rebellion a capital offense, I, who consider the interest of the future quite as much as he, as positively maintains the contrary. In other words, he's saying, listen, Cleon thinks that you have to act this way to kind of prevent future revolts. We have to just kill all the men and slave all the women, because this will send a clear result. He thinks this will stay for future results. I'm not as I I don't think that's really in our interest in this sense. This might actually backfire in that sense. Um, Maintain the contract in section 4. And I require you not to reject my useful considerations versus suspicious ones. His speech may have the attraction of seeming more just in your present temper against the meddling. But we are not a court of justice, but a political assembly. In other words, he's saying that we have to, this is not about justice. It's about interest. Politics is about interest, not justice. A court is about justice. Okay? This is about, the political assembly is about not justice, the interest of Athens, and only the interest of Athens should be at things. So while, and he's, ways, Theodotus is criticizing him of doing the same thing that he accuses others of doing. In other words, of using speech to kind of disrupt it, and by bringing the wrong kind of speech here, by talking about justice of the matter. All right, he goes, uh, 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 and the question of is not justice, but how to make the Metelians useful to Athens. Now, of course, commanders have enacted the penalties of death for many offenses far lighter than this. Still, hope leads men to venture, and no one has yet put himself in peril without the inward conviction that he should succeed in his design. Again, there was ever a city rebellion that did not believe that it possessed either in itself or the alliance resources adequate of this enterprise. All cities and individuals are alike prone to error, and there is no law that will prevent them. Or why should men have exhausted the list of punishments in search of enactments to protect them from evildoers? It is probable that in earlier times these penalties for great offenses were less severe, and that as they were disregarded, the penalty of death had been by decree in most cases arrived at, which is itself disregarded in like manner. Either then, some means of terror more terrible than this must be discovered, or else, or it must be admitted that this restraint is useless. And as long as poverty gives men the courage of necessity, and plenty fills them with ambition, that which belongs to insolence and pride, that each of the other conditions of life remains subjugated to some fatal or master passion, so long will the impulse never be wanting to drive men into danger. Hope also, and greed, the one leading the other following. the one conceiving the attempt, the other suggesting the faculty of succeeding, uh, 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 causes the wildest ruin. And though invisible agents are far stronger than the dangers that are seen, than stronger, in other words, are far stronger than the dangers that are seen. Fortune, fortune too powerfully helps the delusion by the unexpected aid that she sometimes lends, tempt men to venture with inferior means. And this is especially the case with communities because the stakes played for are the highest, freedom or empire. And when all are acting together, each man irrationally magnifies his own capacity. In short, it is impossible to prevent, and only great simplicity can hope to prevent human nature doing what it once has set in mind upon by force of law or by any any deterrent force whatsoever. He's arguing against, in other words, he's saying that terror and these things are not enough. He's making the argument that it's much more complicated than Theon argues about the how that if we just killed them and enslaved them, this would be a terror. No, because people were not going to act, and as long as people are poor and rich, the poor will act out of have nothing to lose, and the rich, their ambition will move them. This on 46. We must therefore commit ourselves. We must not therefore commit ourselves to a false policy through a belief in the efficiency of the death punishment of death, or exclude rebels from the hope of repentance and early atonement of their errors. Consider a moment. At present, if a city that has already revolted perceive that it cannot succeed, it will come to terms while it still is able to refund expenses and pay tribute afterwards. In other cases, what city thinks you will not prepare better than is now done, and hold out to the last against procedures? If it is all one, whether it surrenders late or sooner. In other words, okay, if you do your policy, punishing them regardless, if they, make sure they penalty death for them, well, then won't they hold out longer? Won't they not surrender? Now, if they surrender sooner, in other words, we have to make them, we have to give them we have to give them, some incentive to surrender sooner. Because why? If they surrender sooner, the cost of the war is less, and and as long as they can pay the cost of the war, then and maintain the situation and be loyal, then we benefit of this. In other words, um, patriot efforts. And because this is another case. What city thinks you will not prepare better than is now done, and hold out the last against its besiegers? If all, if it is all one, whether it surrenders later or sooner. And how can it be otherwise than hurtful to us to put to be put to the expense of a siege, because surrender is out of the question? And if we take the city to recover a ruined city from which we can no longer draw revenue, which forms our strength against the enemy, we must not therefore sit as judges of the offensive to our own prejudice, but see how moderate chastisements may be enabled to benefit in future by the revenue procuring powers of our dependencies. And we must make up our mind to look for our protection, not to legal terrors, but to careful administration. In other words, we shouldn't be relying on terror and fear to do things. We should be doing better. We should be administering better. At present, we do exactly the opposite. When a free community held in subjection by force rises as the only natural and asserts its independence, it is sooner reduced than we fancy ourselves obliged to punish severely. Although the right course with freedmen is not to chastise them rigorously when they do not rise, but rigorously watch them before they rise and prevent their ever entertaining the idea, and the insurrection suppressed to make a few responsible for it as possible. Only consider what a blunder you will commit by doing as Cleon recommends. The things as are present in all cities. The people is your friend, and either does not revolt with the oligarchy, or if it is forced to do so, becomes at once an enemy of the insurgents. So that in the war with the hostile city, you have the masses on your side. If you butcher the people of Methley, you have nothing to do, who had nothing to do with the revolt, and who, as soon as they got arms of their own motion, surrendered the city. First, you will commit the crime of killing your benefactors, and next, you will play directly into the hands of the higher classes, who will, who, when they indulge their cities to rise, will immediately have the people on their side, having through your having announced in advance the same punishment for those who are guilty and those who are not. On the contrary, if they were guilty, you ought to seem not to notice it, in order to avoid alienating the only class friendly to us. In short, I consider it far more useful for the preservation of our empire to put up with the injustice voluntarily than to put to death, however justly, those it is our interest to keep alive. For as Cleon's idea is that punishment that claims for as for Cleon's idea that in punishment the claims of justice and expediency can both be satisfied, the facts do not confirm the possibility of such a combination. Confess, therefore, that this is the wisest counsel, and without conceding too much either pity or indulgence, by either of what much motives do I, neither by neither of which motive do I any more than Cleon wish you to be influenced upon the plain merits of the case before you. Be persuaded by me to try calmly those of the militians who sent Patches off as guilty, and leave and to leave the rest undisturbed. This is at once best for the future and most terrible to your enemies at the present moment, insomuch as good policy against the adversary is superior to the blind attack of brute force. Now, these are examples of the bronze spheres that found at Athens, showing the letter saying that it was taken by lesbians and dedicated to. Such were the words of Deitonus. The two opponents thus expressed were the ones most directly contradicting each other, and the Athenians, notwithstanding their changing of feelings, now proceeded to a vote with a show of hands, was almost equal, though the motion of Deitonus carried the day. Another trimene was sent forth in haste for fear that the first might reach Lesbos in the interval, and the city might be found destroyed. The first having about a day and a night's start, wine and barley cakes were provided for the vessel by the Messalian advisor in great promise if they arrived in time, which caused the men to use such diligence upon the voyage as they took their meals of barley and kneaded cake with oil and wine. They rolled and slept by turns while the others were at the oars. Luckily, they met no contrary wind, and the first ship, making no haste upon so hurried an errand, while the second pressed with the manner described. The first arrived a little before them. Then Patches not had just only in time read the decree and to prepare to execute the sentence when the second prevented master. The danger of Metylene had indeed been great. The other parties, whom Patches had set off as the prime movers of the rebellion, were upon Cleon's motions put to death by the Athenians. And the number being more than 1,000, the Athenians also demolished the walls of the Mytilene and took possession of their ships. Afterwards, tributes were not imposed upon. Afterwards, tributes were not imposed upon the Lesbians, but all their lands, except that of the Mytilenes, were divided into 3,000 allotments, 300 of which were received and sacred for the gods, and the rest were assigned by lot to Athenian shareholders who were sent out to the island. With these, the lesbians agreed to pay a rent of 2 mina a year for the allotment and the cultivation of the land themselves. The Athenians took possession of the cities on the continent belonging to the Mytilenes, which thus became the future thus became for the future subject to Athens. Such were the events that took place on Lesbos. Um, During that summer, after the reduction of Lesbos, the Athenians under Nicias, son of Nicaritos, made an expedition against the island of Minoa, which lies off Megara, and was used as a fortified post by the Megaeans, who had built a tower on it. Nicias wished to enable the Athenians to maintain their blockade from this nearer station instead of from the Bedorum in Samalis, to stop Peloponnesian triremes and privateers sailing unobserved from the island, as they had been in the habit of doing, and at the same time preventing anything from coming into Megea. Accordingly, after taking two towers projecting on the side of Nicias by siege engines from the sea, and clearing into the entrance into the channel between the island and the shore, he next proceeded to cut off all communications by building a wall on the mainland at a point where the bridge across the Moros enabled reinforcements to be thrown upon the island, which was not far off from the continent. In a few days, sacrificing to accomplish this, he afterwards raised a fort on the island also, and leaving a garrison there, departed with his forces. About the same time this summer, the Plataeans, now being without provisions and unable to support the siege, surrendered to the Peloponnesians in the following manner. The assault had been made upon the walls, which the Plataeans were unable to repel. The Spartan commander, perceiving their weakness, wished to avoid taking the place by storm. His instructions from Sparta had been so conceived in order that if any future time peace should be made with Athens, they should agree each to restore the places that had been taken in the war. Plataea might be held to have come over voluntarily and had not been included in the list. He accordingly sent a herald to them to ask if they were willing to volunteer to surrender the city to the Spartans, and accepting them as judges upon the understanding that the guilty should be punished, and no one should be without no one without form of law. The Plataeans were now in the last state of weakness, and the herald had no sooner delivered his message than they surrendered the city. The Peloponnesians fed them for some days until the judges from Sparta, who were 5 in number, arrived. Upon their arrival, no charges were preferred. They simply called the Plataeans, asked them whether they had done the Spartans an ally service in the war then raging. The Plataeans asked to leave to speak at greater length and disputed the two of their numbers to represent them. Aristomos, son of Eliscleus, and Lacon, son of Aristomatus, Pranos of the Spartans, who came forward and spoke as follows: Spartans, we surrender our city we trust to you, and looked forward to a trial more agreeable to the forms of laws than the present, to which we had no idea being subject. The judges also, in whose hands were consented to be placed ourselves, were you and you only, from which we thought we were most likely to obtain justice, and not other persons, as is now the case. As the matter stands, we're afraid that we have been doubly deceived. We have good reason to suspect not only that the issue to be tried is more terrible of all, but that you will not prove impartial. If we argue from our fact that no accusation was first brought forward to us to answer, but we ourselves had leave to speak, and from questions being being put so shortly that the true answer to the true that a true answer to it tells us where a false one can be contradicted. In this dilemma, our safest one is to own is our only course seems to have been to say something at all risks. Placed as we are, we could scarcely be silent without being tormented by the damning thought that speaking might have saved us. Another difficulty that we have to encounter is the difficulty of convincing you. We are unknown to each other. We might profit by being forward and bring forward new matter to which you were unacquainted. As it is, we can tell you nothing that you do not know already, and we fear that you have condemned us all in your minds of having failed in our duty towards you, and make this our crime. But that is to please a third party. We have submitted to trial the result to which we have already been decided. Nevertheless, we will place before you uh, what we can justly urge, not only on the question of the quarrel which the Thebans have against us, but of also addressing you and the rest of the Hellenes, in which uh, we will remind you of our good service and endeavor to prevail with you. In your to your short question, whether we have done the Spartans and the allies any service in this war, we say, if you ask us as enemies, that to refrain from serving you was not to do you injury. If as friends, that you are more at fault in having marched against us. During the peace and against the Medes, we acted well. We have not been uh, we had now not been the first to break the peace, and we were the only Boeotians who then joined in defending the liberty of the Hellenes against the Persians. Although an island people, we were present at the auctions of Aretemos, at the battle that took place in our territory. We fought by the sides of yourselves and Panusius, and all the other Hellenistic exploits of your time. We took part out of proportions of our strength. Besides, you, as Spartans, ought not to forget that time of the great panic at Sparta after the earthquake, caused by the secession of the Helots to Theon. We sent a third of party to we sent the third part of our citizens to assist you. On these great occasions in the past, such as was the part that we chose, although afterwards we became your enemies. For this you are to blame. When we asked for your alliance against the Theban oppressors, you rejected our petition and told us to go to the Athenians who were our neighbors, as you live too far off. In the war we never have in the war we never had done to you, and never would have done to you anything unreasonable. If we refused to desert the Athenians when you asked us, we did no wrong. They had helped us against the Thebans when you drew back, and we could no longer give them up with honor, especially as we've obtained their alliance and had been admitted to their citizenship at our own request, and receiving benefit at their hands. But it was plainly due our duty loyalty to obey their orders. Beside the fault that either of you may commit when your supremacy must be laid not upon the followers, but upon the chiefs that lead them astray. With regard to the Thebans, they have wronged us repeatedly, and their last aggression, which has been the means of bringing us into our present position, is within your own knowledge. In seizing our city in time of peace, which is more at a holy time of in the month, they justly encountered our vengeance, and according with the universal law which sanctions resistance to an invader, it cannot be right that we should suffer on their account. By taking your own immediate interest in their animosity as the test of justice, you will prove yourself to be servants of expediency rather than judges of right. Though if they seem useful to you now, we and the rest of the Hellenists gave you as much more valuable help at your great time of need, at a greater time of need. You are now you are the assailant, and others fear you. But at the crisis to which we allude, when the barbarians threatened all of us with slavery, the Thebans were on his side. If it is just, therefore, to put our patriotism against our loyalty and so against them, against then, against our error now, if error there has been, and if you will find the merit outweighing the fault, and displaying a juncture, and whether there are few Hellenes who would set their valor against the strength of Xerxes, and when greater praise was theirs who preferred the dangerous path of honor to the safe course of consulting their own interests with respect to the invasion. To these few we belonged, and highly we were honored for it. And yet now we fear to perish at having again acted on the same principle, and choosing to act well with Athens sooner than wisely with Sparta. Yet, in justice, the same case should be decided in the same way, and policy should not mean anything else other than lasting gratitude for the service of a good ally combined with the proper attention to one's own immediate interest. Consider also that at present the Hellenists generally regard you as the model of a worth and honor. And if you pass unjust sentence upon us, in which is no obscure cause, but one in which you, the judges, are illustrious as we, the prisoners, are blameless, take care that displeasure not be felt at unworthy decisions in matter of honorable men made by men yet more honorable than they, and at the cons, cons, consecration, consecration, consecration in the temples of the city, no, of spoils taken from the Plataeans, the benefactors of Hellenes. Shocking indeed it will seem for Sparta to destroy Plataea, and for the city whose name your fathers inscribed upon the tripod at Delphi, for good service, to be by you blotted out from the map of Hellas to please the Thebans. To such a depth of misfortune we have fallen, that while the Medes' success has been our ruin. In other words, we have fallen with that while the Mede success had been our ruin. Thebans now supplant us in your supplant us in your once found regard, and we have been subjected to two dangers, and greatest of any, that of dying of starvation when we had not surrendered our city, and now being tried for our lives. So that we Plataeans, having exerted upon our hope of power in the cause of the Hellenists, are rejected by all, forsaken and assisted, helped by none of our allies, reduced to doubt the stability of our only hope, yourselves. Still, in the name of the gods, who once presided over our confederacy and our good service in the Hellenistic cause, we appeal you to relent, to rescind the decisions which we fear that the Thebans may have obtained from you, to ask back the gift to which you have given them, then they disgrace not you by slaying us, but gain a pure to gain a pure instead of guilty gratitude, and not to gratify others to be yourself rewarded with shame. Our lives may be quickly taken, but it will be a heavy task to wipe away the infamy of the deed, that we are no enemies whom you might justly punish, but friends forced into taking arms against you. To grant us our lives would be therefore a righteous judgment, if you consider also that we are prisoners who surrendered to of our own accord, stretched out our hands for quarter, whose slaughter Hellenic law forbids, and who besides were always your benefactors. Look at the tombs of your fathers, slain by the Persians and buried in your country, to whom year by year we honored with garments and all other dues, and the first fruits that have come, that our land produced in their season, as friends from our friendly country and allies of our old companion in arms. You should not decide aright your conduct. Would Should you not decide aright, your conduct would be the very opposite of ours. Consider only, Parnasius buried them, thinking that he was laying them in friendly ground, and among men as friendly. But you, if you do not kill us and make Plataean territory Theban, you will leave your fathers and kinmen in hostile soil among their murderers, and deprive of all the honors which they enjoy. Which is more, you will enslave the land in which freedom of the Hellenes was won, make desolate the temples of the gods to whom they prayed before they overcame the Persians, and take away your ancestral sacrifices from those who founded and instituted them. Were it not to your glory, Sparta, either to offend in this way against the common laws of the Hellenes and against your own ancestors, or to kill us, your benefactors, to gratify another's hatred without having wronged yourselves? It would be more to your glory to spare us and yield to the impressions of a reasonable companion, reflecting not merely on the awful fate in store for us, but also on the character of the sufferers, and of the impossibility of predicting how soon misfortune may even upon those who deserve it not. We, as we have a right to do, and as our need impels us, entreat you, calling upon the gods, at whom common altar all the Hellenes worship, and hear our request, not to be unmindful of the oaths which your father swore, and which we now plead. We supplicate you to the tombs of your fathers, and appeal those who have gone to save us from falling into the hands of the Thebans. Prevent the dearest friends of the Hellenes from being given up to their most detested foes. We also remind you that of the day on which we did the most glorious deed of your father's side, we who now on this day are likely to suffer that most dreadful fate. Finally, to do what is necessary and yet difficult for men in our situation, that is, to make an end of speaking, since at the ending the peril of our lives are near. We say in conclusion that we did not surrender our city to the Thebans, so that we would preferred inglorious salvation, but trusted it in capitulated it to you, that it would be just if we fail to persuade you to put us back in the same position and let us take the chance that falls on us. And at the same time, we Plataeans, foremost among the Hellenistic patriots and supplicants to you, beseech you not to give us up out of your hands in faith to our most hated enemy, the Thebans, but to be our saviors. Do not, while you free the rest of Hellas, bring us to destruction. Such were the words of the Plataeans. The Thebans, afraid that the Spartans might be moved by what they heard, and came forward, that they too desired to address them of it. This is since the Plataeans had, against their wishes, been allowed to speak at length instead of being confined to a simple answer to the question. Leave them being granted, the Thebans spoke as follows. We should never had asked to make this speech if the politicians on their side had contented themselves to brief answering the questions, and not turned round and made charges against us, coupled with a long defense of themselves upon matters outside the present inquiry, and not even subject to the accusation of in which praise of no one finds fault with. However, since they have done so, we must answer with charges and refute their self-premise praise, in order that not our bad name nor their good may help them, but that you hear the truth on both sides and decide. And the origins of this quarrel is this: that Plataea, some time after the rest of Bactea, together with other places out of which we had driven, we had driven the mixed population, the Plataeans not choosing to recognize our supremacy as had been first arranged, but separating themselves from the rest of the Plataeans, and proving traitors to the nation of the people, we used compulsion, upon which they went over to the Athenians, and which and with them did us much harm, for which we retaliated. Next, when the barbarians invaded Hellenes, when they say that they were the only Boeotians who did not Medianize, and this is where they glorify themselves and abuse us. We say that if they did not Medianize, it was because the Athenians did not do so either. Just as afterwards the Athenians attacked the Hellenes, the Peloponnesians that were given again only Boeotians who Atticized. Yet consider the form of our respective government when that we so acted. Our city at that juncture uh, had neither an oligarchic constitution in which all the nobles enjoyed equal rights, nor a democracy, but that which is most opposed to law and good government, and nearest to tyranny, the rule of a close cabal. Those hoping to strengthen their individual power by the success of the Persians kept the people down by force and brought them into the city. And the city as a whole did not as a whole was not its own mistress when it acted, and not to be reproached for the errors committed while deprived of its regime. Examine only how we acted after the departure of the Persians and recovery of our regime, our constitution, and when the Athenians attacked the rest of Hellenes and favored to subjugate our country, of the greatest part of which faction had already made their master. Did we not fight and conquer at Cornea and liberate Batia? And do we now not actively contribute to the liberation of the rest, providing horse to the cause and force unequal to that of any other city in our confederacy? Let this suffice to the excuses of our Medism. We will not. We now endeavor to show that you have injured the Hellenes more than we, uh, and are more subject, are more deserving of consigned punishment. It is in our defense against us, say you, that you have become allies and citizens of Athens. If so, then you ought only to have been called the Athenians against us, instead of joining them in attacking others. It was open to you to do this if you felt if they were leading you where you did not wish to follow, as Sparta had already was already your ally against the Mede, as you so much insist. And this was surely sufficient for keeping us off, and above all, not allow you to contribute to liberate in security. Nevertheless, your own choice, and without compulsion, you chose to throw your lot in with Athens, and you say that it had been base of you to betray your benefactors, but it was surely far baser and more iniquitous to sacrifice the whole body of Hellenes, your fellow confederates, who were liberating Hellenes, than the Athenians only who were enslaving it. The return that you make them was therefore neither equal nor honorable, since you called them in, and as you say, because you were being oppressed yourself, and then became their accomplices in oppressing others. You should redeem like for like, but it is base to do so when such repayments unjustly harms others. Meanwhile, thus after thus plainly showing that it was not for the sake of the Hellenes that you alone did not mediate, but because the Athenians does not do so either, and you wish to side with them to be against the rest. Now you claim the benefit of good deeds done to you to please your neighbors. This cannot be admitted. You chose the Athenians, and with them you must stand or fall. You can, nor can you plead the league then made and claim that it was now protects you. You abandoned that league and offended against it by helping instead of hindering the subjugation of the Aegeans and the cost of its members, and that not under this compulsion, but while in enjoyment of the same institutions that you enjoy to your present hour, and no one forcing you in your case. Lastly, the invitation was addressed to you before that you were besieged by a neutral, and neither joined either party. To this you did not accept, and whose then merit the destination of Hellenes most justly than yours, who sought their ruin under the mask of honor. The former virtues that you allege you now show not to be proper to your character. The real bent of your nature has been at length damningly proved. When the Athenians took the path of injustice, you followed them. Our unwilling Medism and your willing Atticizing, thus then is our explanation. The last wrong of which you complain consists of our having, as you say, lawlessly invaded your city at time of peace and festival. Hence again, we cannot think that we are more at fault than yourselves. For if our own proper motion we make an armed attack upon your city and ravage his territory, we are guilty. But if the first men among you in estate and family, wishing to put forward in a foreign contention and restore your to common Boschian country, of their own free will invited us, then wherein is our crime? What wrong is done? Who leads us? And as you say, are more to blame who follows? Does not that in our judgment was wrong by either done by them or by us, citizens like yourself, and with more at stake than you. They opened their walls. They opened their walls and introduced us into their own city, not as foes but as friends, to prevent the bad among you from becoming worse, and to give honest men their due, to report principles without attacking persons. To reform principles without attacking persons, since you were not to be banished from your city, but brought home to your kindred, nor to be made enemies to any, but friends alike to all. It was our intention, not hostile, to be proved. Was not hostile, as proved by our behavior. We did no harm to anyone, but publicly invited those who wished to live in under a nation, a nation under the same people, the Boeotian government, to come with us, which at first you gladly did and made an agreement with us on and remained tranquil until you became aware of the smallness of our numbers. Now that it's possible that there might be something not quite fair in our entering without consent of your people, at any rate you did not pay us in kind. Instead of refraining, as we had done, from violence and inducing us to retire by negotiations, you fell upon us in violation of your agreement and slew some of us in fight, of which we do not so much complain, for it was there was a certain justice. But others who held out hand and received quarter, and others and whose lives you subsequently promised us, you lawlessly butchered. If this was not abominable, what is? And after these crimes committed, one after another, the violations of your agreement, the murder of the men afterwards, and the lying breath of your promises not to kill them, if we refrain from injuring your property in the country, you still affirm that we are the criminals and yourself pretend to escape justice. Not so. If these your judges decide right, you will be punished altogether. Such Spartans are the facts. We have gone into them at some length, both on your account and our own, and you may feel that you will justly condemn the prisoners, and we that have been given an additional sanction to our vengeance. We would also prevent you from being melted by hearing of their past virtues, as if any such they had. These may be fairly appealed to by victims of injustice, but only by but only aggravate the guilt of the criminal, since they offend against their better nature. Nor let them gain anything by crying and wailing, by calling upon your fathers' tombs and their own desolate condition. Again, we point to the far more dreadful fate of our youth, butchered at their hands. The so he goes that let's continue some length. They had prevented you from hearing these things. But saying this, it said here. Sorry, I got interrupted. Um, Again, point to the youth, right? Butchered at their hands, and their fathers who fell at Cardia, bringing Bojan over to you, and seated forlorn old men of desperate heart, who with far more reason implored your justice upon the prisoners. The pity which they appealed is due to rather to men who suffered unworthily, those who suffer justly, as they do, on the contrary, subjects for triumph. For their present desolate condition, they have themselves to blame, since they willingly rejected the better alliance. Their lawless act was not provoked by any action but ours. Hate nor injustice inspired their decision, and even now the satisfaction which they afford us is not adequate. They will suffer by a legal sentence, not as they pretend, as supplicating, asking for quarter in battle, but as prisoners who have surrendered upon agreement to take their trial. Vindicate therefore the Hellenic law which they have broken, Spartans, and grant us, the victims of its violations, the reward merited by our zeal. Nor let the supplicants in your favor be by their harangues, but only by the examples of the Hellenists that the contest to which you invite them are of deeds, not words. Good deeds can only be shortly stayed, but where wrongs is due to wealth of language is needed to veil its deformity. However, if leading powers were to do what you are now doing, and put one short question to all alike, were to decide accordingly, men would be less tempted to seek fine praises to cover, would be less tempted to seek fine praises to cover bad actions. Such were the words of the Thecians. The Spartan judges decided the question whether that they received any service of the Plataeans in the war was a fair one. Was a fair one them to put, as they had always invited them to be neutral, agreeably to the original covenant of the Paratians after the defeat of the Persians, and had again offered them the same conditions before the blockade. This having been refused, now they contrived by the loyalty of their intentions released from their covenant, and having been considered suffered evil at the hands of the Plataeans, they have brought them in again one by one and asked each of them the same question, as they said, whether they had done the Spartans and allies a service in the war. And upon saying that they had not, took them out and slew them all without exception. The Plataeans thus massacred was not less than 200, and with 25 Athenians who had shared in the siege. The women were taken as slaves. The city, the Thebans gave for about a year to some political immigrants from Megara and the surviving Plataeans of their own party to inhabit, and afterwards razed it to the ground from the foundations and built on it the precedent of Hera, an inn 200 square feet, with rooms all around, above and below, making use of this purpose of the roofs and doors of the Plataeans, of the rest of the material in the wall, the brass and the iron. They made couches, which they dedicated to Hera, for whom they built a stone chapel of 100 square feet. The land they confiscated and let out on a 10-year lease to Theban occupiers. The adverse attitude of the Spartans in the whole Peloponnesian affair was mainly adapted to please the Thebans, who were thought to be useful in the war as the moment ran. Such was the end of the Plataea at a 93rd year as she became an ally of Athens. Um, so Plataea is raised. Meanwhile, 40 ships of the Peloponnesian had gone to relief of Lesbian, to which we were felt fleeing across the open sea, pursued by the Athenians, were caught in a storm off Crete. Scattering them from made their way to Peloponnese, where they found at Clea 13 Lucretians and Brosset latrines with Brasius, son of Telus, lately arrived to consul Cletus. The Spartan, upon the failure of the Lesbian expedition, resolved to strengthen their fleet and to sail to Corcyraean, where a revolution had broken out, and to arrive there before 12 Athenian ships at Naples could be reinforced from Athens. Brasidas and Clytus sought to prepare. Now he speaks, and this is the Croatian Revolution began with the return of prisoners taken off the sea fight of Epidus. These the Corinthians had released, normally upon the securing of 800 talons, given them the proximity, but in reality upon their engagement to bring over the Corinth from Corinth. These men proceeding to canvass such of the citizens to intrigue with the aims of detaching the city from Athens. Upon the arrival of an Athenian and a Corinthian eventual, with envoys on board, a conference was held in which the Corinthians voted to remain allies of the Athenians according to their agreement, but to be friends with the Peloponnesians as they had been, in other words, formerly. Meanwhile, the return principal brought Pericles, a volunteer Proxius of the Athenians and leader of the commons, to trial upon the charge of enslaving Corinth to Athens. He, being acquitted, retorted by accusing the five of the richest and their number of cutting stakes on the ground sacred to Zeus and Elencus, and illegal penalty being a starter for each stake. Upon their conviction, the amount of the penalty being very large, they seated themselves as supplicants in the temples to be allowed to pay for it by installments. But Pedius, who was one of the consuls, prevailed upon their body to enforce the law, whereupon the accused, rendered desperate by the law, and also learning that Pedis had intentions, while still a member of the council, to persuade the people to conclude a defense and offensive treaty with Athens, banded together with daggers, and suddenly bursting into the council, killed Bactrius and 60 others, council members and private persons, some few only being the party of Petus, taking refuge in the Athenian Trimene, which had not yet departed. After this outrage, the conspirators summoned the Croatians to an assembly and said that this would in turn turn out for the best and would save them from being enslaved by Athens. For the future, they moved to receive neither party unless they came peacefully in a single ship, treating any other numbers as enemies. This motion made, they compelled it to be adopted, and instantly set off to Athens to justify what had been done, and to dissuade refugees from taking proceedings against the which might lead to a reaction. Upon arrival in embassy, the Athenians arrested the envoys, who were all listened to were listened to them as revolutionists, and enlarged them in Aegea, while the Corinthian tribune arrived on the island with Spartan envoys. Those in control of Korea attacked the people and defeated them in battle. Night coming on, the people took refuge in the Acropolis and the height part of the city and concentrated themselves there, having also possession of the Hellenic harbor. The adversaries were occupying the agora, where most of them lived, and the harbor adjoining them, looking inland. The next day passed in skirmishes of little importance, each party sending into the country to offer freedom to the slaves and to invite them to join. The mass of the slaves answered the appeal of the people, their antagonists being reinforced by 800 mercenaries from the mainland. After the day's interval, the hostilities were recommenced, victory remaining the people, whom had the advantage in numbers and positions, and the women who valiantly assisted them, pelting the tiles of their houses, and now supporting the melee with the fortitude beyond their sex. Towards dusk, the oligarchs, in full rout, fearing that the victorious commons might assault and carry the arsenal, put them to the sword, set fire to the houses around the agora and large houses in order to bar their advance, sparing neither their own nor theirs of the neighbors, of which stuff of merchants was consumed, and the city risked total destruction if a wind had come to help by blowing on it. Hostilities now ceased while both sides kept quiet, passing on guard. The Corinthian ship stole out to sea upon the victory of the people, and most of the mercenaries passed over secretly to the continent. The next day, the Athenian general Nicolas, son of Deva, came upon the Nicopolis with 12 ships and 500 Messalian hoplites. He at once endeavored to bring about a settlement and persuaded the two parties to agree to bring the 10 to trial, the 10 ringleaders who are no longer in the city, while the rest were to live in peace, making terms with each other and entering into alliance with the Athenians. He thus arranged. He was about to sail away when the leader of the people induced him to leave them 5 of his ships to make their adversaries less disposed to make trouble, while they manned and sent him an equal number of their own. As he had no sooner consented than they began to enroll their enemies for the ships, and fearing that they might be sent off to Athens, seated themselves as supplicants in the temple of Dioscuri. When the attempt of Naucus to reassure them and to persuade them to rise proved unacceptable, the people, armed upon this pretext, alleged their refusal of their adversaries to sail with them as proof of their hollowness of their intentions, and took their arms out of their house, and would even killed some whom they fell in with, if not Knossos Nikos Strakos had not prevented it. The rest of the party, being not less than 400 in number, seeing that what was going on, seated themselves as supplicants at the temple of Hera, until the people, fearing that they might adopt some desperate resolution, induced them to rise and conveyed over to the island, to the temple where the provisions were set across to them. At this stage, the revolution, the 4th and 5th day, the removal of the men to the island, and the Peloponnesian ships arrived from Gallina, where they had been stationed since the return of Ionia. 53 in number, still in command of Euclides, but with Barastus on the side of his advisor, thus dropping anchor at Stibota on the harbor on the mainland at daybreak to make sail for Corcyraean. The Koreans, in great confusion and alarm at the sight of the state of things in the city and the approach of the invader, at once proceeded to equip 60 vessels, which they sent out fast as they were manned against the enemy, in spite the Athenians recommending to let them sail out first and follow themselves afterward with a ship. Upon their vessels coming up the enemy, in this straggling fashion, the two immediately deserted, and others the crews fighting among themselves, and there was no order to anything was done. So the Peloponnesians, seeing the confusion, placed 20 ships in opposite to the Corcyraeans and arranged the rest against the 12 Athenian ships, amongst which there were two vessels, Semelus and Piraeus. While the Corcyraeans attacked without judgment and in small detachments, were already crippled by their own misconduct. The Athenians, afraid of the number of the enemy and laid be surrounded, did not venture to attack the main body even the center of a division opposed him, but fell on its wings and sank one vessel after another, at which the Peloponnesians formed a circle, and the Athenians rolled after them, tried to throw them off into disorder. Perceiving this, the Peloponnesian division, opposed to the Corcyraeans, fearing the repulsions of the disaster of Nicopolis, came to support their friends, and the whole fleet, now united, bore down the Athenians, who retreated before it backing water, withdrawing leisurely as possible to give the Corcyraeans time to escape the enemy that was kept occupied. Such the character of the sea fight, which lasted until sunset. Now the Corcyraeans now feared that the enemy would follow up their victory, and sailed against the city and rescue the men on the island, strike some other equally decisive blow. Accordingly, carried the men off again to the temple of Hera, and God kept over the city. The Peloponnesians, however, victorious in the sea fight, did not venture to attack the city, but took to 13 Korean vessels which they had captured with them, sailed back to the continent from which they put out. The next day, again, refrained from attacking the city, although disorder and panic were at the height. Though Brassus said it was said urged Alot, his superior officer, to do so, but they landed upon the promontorial of Lucrede and laid waste the country. Meanwhile, the people in Korea, still being in great fear of a fleet attacking them, came to a parley with the supplicant of their friends in order to save the city, and prevailed upon them, some of them, to go aboard the ships, of which they still manned 30, captured against expect. But the Peloponnesians, after ravaging the country until midday, sailed away, and towards nightfall they informed by small beacon signal of the approach of 60 Athenian vessels from the Grecians under the command of Euthymenon, son of Thucydides, which had been sent off by the Athenians upon the news of the revolution, with the fleet of Alcestis now being set sail for Croatia. The Peloponnesians accordingly at once set off in haste at night for home, coasting along the shore, and hauling their ships off the isthmus of Lucrece in order not to be seen doubling it, so departed. The Croatians, made aware of this approach of the Athenian fleet and of the departure of the enemy, brought the Mysileans from outside the walls of the city, and ordered the fleet which they had manned to sail into the Hellenic harbor, and while it was doing so, slew much of their enemy as they laid hands on, killing afterwards, as they landed, those who they had persuaded to go upon the ships. Next, they went to the sanctuary of Hera and persuaded 50 men to take their trial and condemn them all to death. The mass of supplicants who had refused to do so, on seeing what has been taking place, slew each other there on consecrated ground, while others hanged themselves upon the trees and destroyed themselves as they were severely able. During 7 days, the Euthymenon stayed with his 60 ships. The Croatians were engaged in butchering those of their fellow citizens whom they regarded as their enemies. And though the crime imputed was that of attempting to put down the democracy, some were also slain for private hatred. Others for their debt, their debtors because of the money they owed them. Death thus raged in the city in every shape, and as usually happens in such times, there was no length to which violence did not go. Sons Sons were killed by their fathers, supplicants dragged from the altars were slain upon it, while some were even walled up in the temples of the Dionysus and died there. So bloody was the march of the revolution, and the impression was made that it was the greater of it as it was one of the first to occur. Later on, one may say, the whole of the Hellenic world was convulsed, struggled being everywhere made by popular leaders to bring in the Athenians and by the oligarchs to induce the Spartans. In peace, there would have been neither the pretext nor the wish to make such an invitation, but in war, with the alliance always at command of either faction, for the hurt of their adversaries and their own corresponding advantage, opportunities for bringing in foreigners were never wanting to revolutionary parties. The suffering which revolution entailed upon the city were many and terrible, such as occurred and always will occur as long as the nature of mankind remains the same. Though it in a severe and milder form, the varying of their symptoms according to the varieties of the particular cases. In peace and prosperity, city and individuals have better sentiments because they do not find themselves suddenly confronted with imperious necessity. But war takes away the ease supply of daily wants, and to prove a rougher master that brings most men's character to the level of their fortunes. Revolution thus ran the course from city to city, and the places which it arrived last, from having heard from what had been done before, carried still greater excesses and refinement of their inventions, as manifested in the cunnings of their enterprises and atrocities of their reprisals. Words had to change their ordinary meanings and to take what which had been given them. Reckless audacity came to be considered courage of a loyal supporter. Prudent hesitation, suspicious cowardice. Moderation was held to be a cloak of unmanliness. Unable to see all sides of a question, incapacity to act on any. Frantic violence became the attribute of manliness, Cautious plotting of a justified means, in other words, cautious plotting a justifiable means of self-defense. The advocate of extreme measures was always trustworthy, his opponent a man to be suspected. To succeed in a plot was to have a shrewd head, to divine a plot still shrewder. But to try to provide against having to do either was to break up your party and to be afraid of your adversary. In short, to forestall an intending criminal. No, no, it was in short, to forestall an intending criminal, or to suggest that the idea of a crime where it was lacking was equally condemned. In other words, to forestall an intending criminal, or to suggest that the idea of a crime where it was lacking was equally condemned, until even blood became a weak tie than party. In other words, that party even blood loyalties. From the superior readiness of these of those united by the latter to dare everything without reserve, for such association brought not the blessings derivable from established institutions, but were formed by ambitions to overthrow them. The confidence of their members in each other rested on sorry, and the confidence of each of the members in each other rested on any religious sanction than upon complicity in crime. The fair proposals of the adversary were met with jealous precautions by the stronger of the two, and not with the generous confidence. Revenge also was held of more account than self preservation. Oath of reconciliations being offered only on either side to meet an immediate difficulty, only held good as long as no other weapon was at hand. But when opportunity arose, he who first ventured to seize it would take his enemy off guard, thought that this perfidious vengeance sweeter than than an open one, since consideration of safety apart, success by treachery won him the praise for superior intelligence. Indeed, it was generally the case that men are readily to call rogues clever than simpletons honest, and are as ashamed of being the second as they are proud of being the first. All the cause of all these evils was the lust for power arising from greed and ambition. From these passions proceed the violence of parties, once engaged in contention. The leaders in the cities made their fairest professions. The leaders of the cities made their fairest processions. On the one side, with the cries of political equality of the people, and on the other, moderate aristocracy. But they sought prizes for themselves in those public interests which they pretended to cherish, and stopping at nothing in their struggles for ascendancy, engaged in direct excesses. In their acts of vengeance, they went to even greater lengths, not limiting them to what justice or good of the city demanded, but making the party a caprice of the moment their only standard. The party benefit, I mean, the party decision or thought or whim, caprice of the moment, their only standard, and invoking with each readiness the condemnation of unjust verdict on the authority of a strong arm to glut the animosities of the hour. Thus, religion was was in honor with neither party, but the use of fair phrases to arrive at guilty ends was in high reputation. Meanwhile, the moderate part of the citizens perished between the two, either uh, uh, for not joining in the quarrel, or because envy would not suffice to escape them. Thus, every form of inquiry took form of inequity took root in the Hellenic country by reasons of the troubles. The ancient simplicity with which honor so largely entered was laughed down and disappeared, and society became divided into camps in which no man trusted his fellow. To put an end to this, there were neither promise to be depended upon, nor oath that could be counted command respect, but all parties dwelling rather in their calculations upon the hopelessness of their present state of things, were more intent upon self-defense than capable confidence. In this contest, the blur wits were the most successful. The blunters, not blurred, blunter wits. In this contest, the blunter wits, in other words, were aggressive and were the most successful. Apprehensive of their own deficiencies and the cleverness of their antagonists, they feared to be worst in debate and to be surprised by the combinations of the more versatile opponent, and so at once boldly had recourse to action, while their adversaries, arrogantly thinking that should know in time and that it was unnecessary to secure by action what policy could provide, often fell victim to their lack of precaution. Meanwhile, Korea first gave the first example of most of the crimes alluded to. The reprisals enacted by by those who govern, who never experience equitable treatment, or indeed anything but insolence from their rulers, or whence their hour came, of the inequities resolved for those who desired to get rid of their accused poverty, and ardently coveted their neighbors' goods, and lastly, by the savage and pitiless excesses to which men who had begun the struggle not in class but in party spirit were hurried by their ungovernable passions. In conclusion, in the confusion into which life had now been thrown in the cities. Human nature, always rebelling against the laws, and now its masters gladly showed itself ungoverned in passions, above respect for justice, and the enemy of all superiority. Since revenge would not have been set above religion, and gain above justice, had it not been for the fatal power of envy. Indeed, men too often take upon themselves, in the prosecution of their revenge, to set the example of doing away with those general laws to which all alike can look for salvation in adversity, instead of allowing them to subsist against the day of danger when their aid may be required. While the revolution passion for this first time displayed themselves in the factions of Korea, Euthymidan and Athens' fleet sailed away, after which some 500 Corinthian exiles who had succeeded in escaping took some forts on the mainland and become masters of Corinthian territory on the mainland, made their base to plunder their countrymen on the island, and did so much damage as to cause a fertile famine in the city. They also sent envoys to Sparta and Corinth to negotiate their restoration, but meeting with no success afterwards, got boats together, boats and mercenaries, and crossed over to the island, being about 600 in all, burned their boats, so to have no hope of becoming masters of their country, went upon Mount Issus and fortified themselves, began to harm those in the cities, and obtain command of the country. At the close of the summer, the same summer, the Athenians sent 20 ships under the command of Laches, son of Menapos, and Chelocides, the son of Epirus, to Sicily, where the Syracusans and Leontians were at war. The Syracusans, for their allies, had for their allies all the Dorian cities except Comaria. These had been induced by the Lacedaemonian Confederacy to form commencement of the war, though they had not taken active part of it. The Leontians had and Comea and the Clalidian cities. In Italy, the Laurentians were for the Syracusans, the Rhegians for the Leonine kinsmen. The allies of the Leonides now sent to Athens and appealed to their ancient alliance and their Ionian origin to persuade the Athenians to send them a fleet as the Syracusans were blocking them by land and sea. The Athenians sent it upon the plea of their common descent, but in reality to prevent the exportation of Sicily corn to the Peloponnese and to the rest, and to test the possibility of bringing Sicily into subjugation, according which they themselves at Reglitum in Italy from hence carried on the war on convert against their allies. And ends the summer. So we just went through that to the summer. So that was a long episode. We dealt with the initial constitution of Corinth, the Corinthian Civil War, the revolution or stasis of the civil war at Croatia is a drastic thing. I should have probably had two sessions of this. Again, I should have, I wasn't, and I was interrupted, and therefore threw me off for a while there. So we're going to stop here. This is the end of the summer. We're going to do the winter next time. If you have any comments, please put them below. If you liked it, like it, share it with a friend. Subscribe. Ask a friend to subscribe. Again, that's why we build a channel. You can follow me on social media below. If you, I have some subscribe star. If you want to help in this thing, please do so. I mean, this is what I'm trying to build this up and some more. Again, I would like to do this more than like doing extra courses in other places. Maybe do courses for you guys rather than do courses for classes. That's it. Have a good day. by but.